Now, today we're in the season of Epiphany, and I wanted to preach the sermon on the 4 keys to joy. So we put off what would ordinarily be the first scripture for the season of Epiphany, is the one we're going to read today from Mark. It's about the baptism of Jesus. So we're going to look at the meaning of this word, epiphany. It's a terrific word, but you may not be familiar with it. We've got 4 definitions here. First of all, a Christian festival observed on January the 6th. Remember the Kings? We had the Kings on January the 6th. It's also the baptism of Jesus. We celebrate that day. So it's a festival and a season in the liturgical year. And then this is the definition that I think is important for us today. An appearance or manifestation, especially of a deity. And that's what our text is about today. This third one is a good definition as well. A sudden intuitive perception or insight into the reality of essential meaning of something, usually initiated by some simple, homely, or commonplace occurrence or experience. In other words, it's what I oftentimes call an unveiling. You're having an ordinary experience, and all of a sudden, there's an unveiling, a revealing of some powerful truth behind that experience. And there's a 4th definition that's not quite as relevant for us today. Now let's read from the Gospel of Mark. Early on, Mark goes right into the story of John the Baptist. Matthew and Luke both have a Christmas story. Matthew actually begins with the genealogy that Denise preached on a few weeks ago. But Mark skips all of that and goes right into the story of John the Baptist. And then quickly, this intersection between the ministry of John the Baptist and the ministry of Jesus. And after that, then he follows the story of Jesus. And this is where we are. John the Baptizer appeared in the wilderness proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And people from the whole Judean countryside and all the people of Jerusalem were going out to him and were baptized by him in the river Jordan, confessing their sins. Now John was clothed with camel's hair, with a leather belt around his waist, and he ate locusts and wild honey. He proclaimed, "The one who is more powerful than I is coming after me." He's talking about his cousin Jesus. "I am not worthy to stoop down and untie the thong of his sandals. I have baptized you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit." In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove on him. Here's the Epiphany experience. And a voice came from heaven saying, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, I like this topic, discovering who Jesus is. When we look at a mystery, typically when we're trying to solve a mystery, there are 2 ways to do it. One is what I call the Sherlock Holmes method, or the old Columbo, Peter Falk. How many of you remember Columbo, Peter Falk method? He was in the line of Sherlock Holmes. It's what we call the deductive method of reasoning. So the detective trying to get to the truth, trying to solve this mystery, who done it, the detective starts off with a general theory of the case, a hypothesis, a kind of a big idea. And then through reasoning, deductive reasoning, tries to put together all of the events and happenings that led to the crime and be able to prove it through a kind of rational process. That's deductive reasoning. That's Peter Falk and Columbo. The other way of solving a mystery is through inductive reasoning. And inductive reasoning is where you start with all of the specific things, little facts and pieces, scientific evidence here and there. And you all know about this way of solving a mystery because we see it on TV all the time these days. NCIS and CSI and all the spinoffs of those programs on television, all of that is inductive reasoning. You start with little pieces of information. You start with the fingerprints and the blood evidence and the DNA. And then you go and you get the body and you put the body on the slab in the morgue and you do the autopsy. And finally you gather up all of these little facts about what took place. And when you put it together, there's no mystery at all about who committed the crime. You've got the fingerprints, you've got the DNA evidence, all of that. I don't know about you, but I get tired of this. I mean, my wife loves all these shows, NCIS, CIS, and so whenever I walk into the room, she's got the TV going on, and there's always an autopsy taking place. Now look, you laugh about this, but try walking in at dinner time, and your wife is sitting there making spaghetti while watching an autopsy. It's just pretty irritating. So those are the two main ways we have of solving a mystery. But when we come to this question about who is Jesus, neither one of them really works. We open the Bible and we see these stories about Jesus, and we have these powerful hints about who Jesus is. And through the years, we've tried to figure it out. Those of you who have been to Jerusalem, it's such a powerful thing to walk through the old city of Jerusalem and know that you're walking in the same steps that Jesus walked. And yet when you come to these great historic sites, Golgotha the place, there's still ambiguity. Historians disagree on whether this is the place where Jesus died on the cross, or this is the place, or exactly where the tomb is. And through the years, we've tried to get scientific and archaeological evidence to just prove exactly who Jesus was, where he lived, exactly what he did. And none of it's ever really come together enough that we say, that's it. I think that's the way it's intended to be. When we open the Bible and we read about Jesus, there's still this element of what I would call powerful mystery, which gives us these great hints about who he is, and yet we know that the power of Jesus who walked on the earth 2,000 years ago, and the power of Jesus who still lives in the world today, the power of Jesus is a mystery, the power of which is beyond what we can fully understand. I think that's the way it was meant to be. But this story from Mark gives us a tremendous start on understanding who Jesus was. Jesus comes walking along. I mentioned John the Baptist was a cousin to Jesus, and they'd gone their different ways. But Jesus comes walking along, and John the Baptist is there in the River Jordan, and he's baptizing people. And the Gospels make clear that John the Baptist didn't think it was his job to baptize Jesus, but Jesus wanted to be baptized. And so there's this powerful scene where Jesus walks out into the middle of the water, and John baptizes him. And Jesus rises from the baptismal waters. And if you'll use your imagination, you can see this, the water dripping from his long hair. And the way the gospel writers write this, it's a public event, but this is, I think, a private revelation. It looks like only Jesus saw it, but the heavens open, and the Spirit of God is there, and Jesus hears the words, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." God says to Jesus, "You belong to me. You belong to me." What a powerful moment that was for Jesus. One of the theological questions that we deal with as ministers and theologians in the New Testament was, when did Jesus know? When was the first time that Jesus knew that he was the Messiah? And there are various answers to that. Maybe he knew it as he was growing up. You know, we have stories from Luke about Jesus going to the synagogue, and surely he had some hint that he was somehow had a special relationship to God. But in this moment, as he rises from the baptismal waters and he hears the words of God, surely this moment confirmed for him any hint he might have had. You belong to me. And from this moment on, his eyes are laser locked onto the will of God. We'll see in the first Sunday of Lent in March that immediately the Spirit of God drove him into the wilderness and into the beginning of his public ministry. Of course, the real question about who was Jesus really comes down to the question, I think, about who is Jesus to you? Or who is Jesus to me? And so let me ask you this question. When was the first time you knew that you belonged to God? How long has it been since you thought about that question, or has it ever been asked before? When was the first time that you knew, I belong to God? If you stop and think about it, that really is the question, isn't it? I mean, that's the question for you and me, whether or not we have this deep, powerful understanding that we belong to God. Because the answer to that question is the answer to everything. If you've had that experience that you belong to God, then you know it makes a difference. It means that you didn't come into the world as an accident. In spite of what some people say, it wasn't some kind of a biochemical process that was just a random act, the forces of nature that brought you into this world and into this life. That word from the psalmist, I love quoting this, you know. The psalmist saying, you are weaved together in the womb of your mother. Those are two different understandings of life, aren't they? The difference between being a biochemical random act of nature and being woven together in the womb of your mother by God who loves you and who says, you belong to me. And so if you've had that experience where somehow you just knew, you'd heard the word that you belong to God, then you know that your life has meaning and purpose. And that's an important thing to know, isn't it? Because life doesn't always feel good. Sometimes these dreary days like we've been having here, life just doesn't feel good. And so it's important to remember, I belong to God, and my life has meaning and purpose, even in the tough times of life. It's what animates us and motivates us and moves us as the people of God. Just the knowledge, that epiphany, that unveiling of God's truth. Yes, I belong to God. Of course, we have to be honest about this. It's not like the spiritual journey is just kind of one straight line in which we grow closer and closer to God, in which our faith grows more and more powerful and meaningful. There are always these zigzags, what I call the zigzags in the spiritual journey. This last Friday, I went down to SMU, Perkins School of Theology at SMU, and SMU, Dr. Turner was there, and Craig Hill, our dean at Perkins, is there. Really nice luncheon called, this is a series they have, a really nice luncheon called Public Life, Private Faith. And the speaker for this was Judy Woodruff of PBS News. And I was invited by the bishop to go with him, but I was thrilled to do this because I love Judy Woodruff. This is a little bit personal, but I like PBS NewsHour. You know, it started here in Dallas. Jim Lehrer, years ago, those of you that are old timers, the Robin McNeil, Jim Lehrer. But PBS NewsHour, 6 o'clock, I just think they work harder than anybody else to be unbiased in their news reporting. They may not be perfect. And Judy Woodruff is the anchor, and she's the one that really drives that. And you could hear this in the interview they did with her at SMU. She just talked about how we don't get it perfect, but we're just extremely focused on reporting the news and being unbiased and going in depth. So that's my show. I watch it every night. But there's this powerful moment. She was interviewed about, you know, the typical questions about journalism today and what's going on in the life of the country. But then they got to the part about her private faith, and she shared with us her own journey. She and her husband are Episcopalians. They go to an Episcopalian church there in Washington, D.C. when they're in town. She's out a lot, of course. But she said this, you know, it's not like my faith has never been tested. And then she shared this extremely personal story about an older son. And I looked it up. It's got some more details. He was born with some birth defects, but at 16 they did some routine surgery and just everything fell apart. So he's dramatically disabled. He's 35 years old now and has been for all those years. And she said, you know, when this happened, we were just devastated. And she said, it tested my faith. I thought, no, Surely, God, no, how could you do this? How could there be a God that allows something like this to happen? But she said, we moved on and faith revived. But you know that story, don't you? You know that story, that zigzag in your spiritual journey. At least if you've lived any time at all. Maybe you're young and it hasn't happened. But if you've lived any time at all, you know what it means when there's the zigzag in your spiritual journey and life falls apart. Maybe it's the loss of a child, or the loss of a marriage, and you think, God, surely, no. What God could allow this to happen? And then somehow, in the midst of the darkness and the doubt, the zigzag journey moves you forward, and you know that God has been with you every step of the way. I'll tell you what else happens that's almost as dangerous, I think. It's when the zigzag in our journey takes us into a place where things are going so well, we just forget about the one who's walking with us. It's not that we just say, well, he's not there. It's just that we get so full of ourselves when things are going well. The business is going well, or the job is going well. The marriage couldn't be better. The children are thriving. The retirement bank account is doing good. The stock market's doing well. And there's just this inevitable seduction. Listen, I've been a pastor all my life, and I've been seduced into this myself, so I know. We get seduced into believing that we don't really need him. It's not a conscious decision. We never just say, Jesus, I don't need you anymore. Honestly, I've known people who've done that. A few people, but most of us don't do that. I've got a story. It just came to me. I'm not going to tell it. I didn't have it planned. But I've had people say to me, no, we don't think we need God anymore. We don't need the church anymore. Things are going well. But for most of us, we don't say that. Of course we don't. Who would say something like that? But nevertheless, it is true that you just kind of get to moving on your journey in such a way that the one who is walking with you becomes less and less important, because you're doing it all yourself, aren't you? You've got skills and talents and money, and you can plan out your life. Until the zag goes back to a zig. And all of a sudden, you think, where is God in my life? Where is God in my life? And you start looking for the one who's walking with you. And you go back to church. You go back to church and say, oh my God, why did I ever leave this place where every day the word is proclaimed? That in the midst of failure, God brings good news. You go back to church where you hear this word redemption, where you, in spite of everything that has gone wrong, you hear the word redemption, you say, yeah, this is about getting a second chance, another chance. You go back to church where you hear, in the midst of the darkness, there is the light, and the light shines and the darkness cannot overcome it. You go back to the church and you find yourself standing there singing next to someone who's singing at the top of their lungs. And you say, in the midst of the despair, there is joy. And suddenly you know that he's never deserted you. And that your journey through life wouldn't be the same. It couldn't be the same. That honestly, your journey through life just couldn't be without him. Who is Jesus? In the final analysis, the only answer to that really counts is this: who is Jesus in your life? Who is Jesus to me. And the gospel writer Mark has inspired me to think about it in this way. Me, standing in the midst of the baptismal waters, the waters flowing down my face, looking at him, Jesus, the water dripping from his hair, and the heavens opening, and saying to him, maybe it was a private proclamation, you are my beloved, you're my child, you belong to me. And Jesus looking me in the eyes and saying, you belong to me. Take my hand and we'll cross from the river and we'll do this together.